The Association of American Medical Colleges is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Open Science by Design. My name is Sandy, and it's my pleasure to be the facilitator for today's event. I'd like to formally welcome the participants who are joining us today. Please note that today's call is being recorded and will be available online in 3 to 5 business days. All participant phone lines will be muted during this broadcast. If you experience technical difficulties with the web portion of today's program, please email aamc@compartners.com. If you are listening to the program over the phone and you need assistance at any time, please press *0 and an operator will assist you. This presentation will last up to 60 minutes and will include question and answer opportunities during the webinar and at the end. You may submit a question at any time by typing into the chat box at the lower left corner of your screen and clicking on the send button. I'd like to direct your attention to the links box on the left of the screen where resources are located for you to view, save, or print. Simply click on the link and a separate web browser window will open. This will not interfere with your viewing of the program. It's now my pleasure to introduce our hosts. The Association of American Medical Colleges and the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology have partnered to launch a monthly webinar series to discuss the major findings, recommendations, and implementation strategies from 5 reports from the National Academy of Sciences.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Sandy. My name is Amanda Field, and I am a Science Policy Specialist at AAMC. I work in the Scientific Affairs Unit at AAMC, in which my team and I focus on improving and communicating research and research training policy issues that affect our member academic medical institutions.
Hi, and I am Teresa Ramirez, the Diversity and Inclusion Policy and Outreach Specialist at the Office of Public Affairs at FASEB.
These 2 organizations bring to you this webinar series on several National Academies 2018 reports that are relevant to the biomedical community, which you see pictured here, including their upcoming webinars on the next generation, integrating humanities and STEM in higher education, and sexual harassment reports.
The goal of this series is to not only relay the key findings and recommendations of the reports, but to provide the community with a chance to interact and discuss their concerns over and efforts to implement these recommendations at their own institutions. For this webinar, we will be focusing on the report Open Science by Design, which discusses the global research enterprise and the movement of its stakeholders towards a new open science ecosystem.
Today, Study Director Mr. Tom Arison will be summarizing the key findings of the report, and then the presentation will focus on the implementation of 2 essential recommendations. 1, creating a culture that actively supports open science, and 2, training students and other researchers to implement open science practices effectively. This webinar will also feature speakers from the American Geophysical Union and the Center of Open Science, who will discuss how institutions can implement these 2 recommendations. There is an open chat box that the participants can use to communicate with us and with each other. So please do not hesitate to enter your thoughts or any comments that you might have throughout the webinar, including any work that is being done at your institution or organization.
And now I'd like to introduce Mr. Tom Harrison, Program Director in the National Academy's Development, Security, and Cooperation Division and Study Director for this report.
Thanks very much to AAMC and FASEB and to Amanda and Teresa in particular for organizing this and hosting us. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about our reports, and we work hard on them and hope that they contribute to the broader scientific enterprise. I'd also like to thank Ian Sullivan and Brooks Hansen for participating as discussants. So the Open Science by Design, Realizing a Vision for 21st Century Research report took about a year to complete. It was released in July of 2018. We started the first meeting July 2017. It is a consensus study, what we call at the Academy is a consensus study, a committee-authored document that has findings and recommendations. It's overseen by the Board on Research Data and Information in the Policy and Global Affairs Division. The authoring committee was 10 members led by Alexa McCrae of Harvard Medical School, It was a great committee, and the support for this study was provided by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, which is greatly appreciated. So the committee's focus in this study was to identify and address the challenges of broadening access to scientific research and develop recommendations aimed at moving toward open science as the default for scientific research results. Although the report does spend a fair amount of time talking about the benefits of open science and demonstrating those through examples and other evidence, it wasn't a part of the task to demonstrate the value of open science. And open science, for those who don't already know, aims to ensure the open availability and usability of scholarly publications, the data that result from scholarly research, and the methodologies, including code and algorithms, that were used to generate those data. The open science movement began probably with and focused on articles in the early 2000s and has broadened since then to encompass data and methods, including software code. The benefits and motivations of open science include rigor and reliability. If articles and underlying data and methods are open and transparent and accessible, it is easier for researchers to check the work of others and to find mistakes and to correct those. The ability to address new questions. If data and methods and articles are open and accessible and machine readable, it's easier to discover relationships between complex systems that may not be obvious, and that's one of the benefits that will expand in the future as artificial intelligence and machine learning are applied to research, that openness of data and methods and articles will, and the ability to semantically link will enable discoveries in different fields, in linking different fields. The open science enables the faster and more inclusive dissemination of knowledge. It allows for access by researchers in developing countries and in institutions that may not be as research intensive, and allows them to participate in research. The citizen science is also enabled by open access to articles and data and methods, in that citizens and the broader public can participate in research in areas such as astronomy, where the availability of images and astronomical data has led to discoveries by citizen scientists. It allows, open science also allows the effective use of resources. For example, laboratory animal experiments, if that data can be made available and reused, it allows you to discover more things and not have to use as many laboratory animals or to have as many human subjects undergoing treatments in clinical trials. The open science also allows the improved performance of research tasks and more efficiency in performing research. And also, the open publication for open benefit reflects the belief that if the public is funding the research, then the public has the right to access the results of that research. The barriers and limits to achieving open science include the costs and infrastructure, and this will be discussed more with the discussants. For example, making data accessible over a longer term requires IT infrastructure and a commitment to keep those things available. The structure of scholarly communications is another barrier. Most publications today are still subscription access only, and so that is a major transition that will come about so that all articles are available. There is a lack of supportive culture, incentives, and training. This will be addressed in one of the recommendations, that the effort needed to make things available, which often the researcher has to make efforts and do work to make data available. Often they may not have an incentive to do that, or sufficient incentives to do that. Privacy, security, and proprietary barriers to sharing exist in certain fields. And there are disciplinary differences in terms of the types of data, the complexity, and the availability. Open science by design is a concept put forward in the report, reflecting that we may be in an inflection point where new information technology tools and services are allowing public and private research funders, publishers, and federal agencies to adopt new policies that promote open science. The Open Science by Design diagram has the various stages of the research process, and the idea is that the researcher is at the center of Open Science by Design, and that they are empowered to provide to make their data available, to receive credit, and to use the data, articles, and methods of others to advance their work, and that the infrastructure and the systems are in place for them to do that. It's a set of principles and practices that empowers the researcher. Going through the report recommendations, all the recommendations have related findings and implementation actions. First is to build a supportive culture and incentives to encourage researchers to adopt open practices. Institutions and others should be implementing training and education for open science by design. The various stakeholders in research enterprise should be working to ensure long-term preservation and stewardship of research products, facilitate data discovery, reuse, and reproducibility according to the FAIR principles, which we'll hear more about later. Findable data in particular should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we should develop new approaches to fostering open science by design, including revisiting some of the federal policies related to open science and integrating and harmonizing those among funders. And the box shows the first two recommendations are the ones that will be covered in depth.
I want to remind everyone to keep using the chat box to insert any questions or comments you may have, information for each other, information for us. We would like everyone to interact with everyone. We're going to move on to talk about that first recommendation about building a supportive culture now, and we'll take questions at the end of this recommendation section.
Right, so the recommendation says research institutions should work to create a culture that actively supports open science by design by better rewarding and supporting researchers engaged in open science practices, and that research funders should provide explicit and consistent support for practices and approaches that facilitate this shift in culture and incentives. And the recommendation recognizes that institutions and funders are the key players in structuring the incentives of researchers, but what we'll hear later also is that professional societies can also take a leadership role in providing infrastructure and support and setting standards that encourage open practices. So implementation actions include explicitly rewarding the efforts to adopt and implement open practices on the part of researchers. Universities should partner with federal agencies to develop incentive for assessment. To develop new methods of assessment that don't rely exclusively on metrics like the journal impact factor. Universities should evaluate published data and other research products in tenure promotion processes. Researchers should make their research openly available and include this information on their CVs. And research sponsors should encourage and reward the use of publicly available research products. Universities and research institutions should encourage and reward studies that focus on reproducibility and replicability.
So now, for the key recommendations for number 1, there's a poll, so you can use your chat box where you can decide whether is your institution planning or has it already started to implement this recommendation. A, my institution has no plans to build a supportive culture around open science. B, my institution plans to build a supportive culture around open science. And C, my institution has already started implementation. Or D, I don't know. So please select what's best. Let's give it a few more seconds and allow people to vote.
I can go ahead and check the boxes on the screen as opposed to using the chat box, so it reads all those in the percentages.
Okay, so far we see that there's a 29%, actually 25% for my institution has no plans to build a supportive culture around open science, with a 13% that my institution plans to build a supportive culture around open science, and with a 33% that my institution has already started this implementation, and 22% I don't know. So this is, I mean, it's getting there. Mm-hmm. All right. So, Tom, we're going to the next recommendation.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So it is my honor to introduce Dr. Brooks Hansen, Executive Vice President at the American Geophysical Union, who will be talking on building a supportive culture implementation. Dr. Hansen.
Hey, thanks. Thanks. I'd like to follow that up with some examples or some description of an effort we're doing in the Earth and Space Sciences on enabling a culture around fair data. So fair is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, focusing mostly on the findable, accessible, because having those two parts enable interoperable and reusable. And I'm going to start kind of from the bottom of the slide. The web address there, we've just got an updated website, so if you just search for COPDESS on Google or just type copdess.org, you'll get to the updated site, which is an HTTPS site. That gives a full project description. The first thing I want to say is this effort has been a really community-driven project. It was also funded by the Lawrence John Arnold Foundation after some initial seed money from NSF and Sloan. And we've involved in implementing this about 300 stakeholders, but it's included most of the publishers in the Earth and Space Sciences, and that includes many publishers that also publish other disciplines as well, so that this effort is easily scalable. So pretty much all the major society and commercial publishers were involved. So Elsevier, Springer Nature, Wiley, Science, AAAS, PNAS, et cetera, and AGU and several other Earth and Space Science societies in collaboration with the repository. So the goal was to have published data go into FAIR compliant repositories and complete links between the publication and the repository so that the data are fully linked. So one thing that came out of this was a commitment statement, which you'll find on that website, which now many publishers and repositories have signed up for. But basically the outcomes are, if we go up to the publishers, all of the publishers have agreed to pretty much use a common set of author guidelines and FAQs around data software and samples. They've agreed to tag citations, data citations to support full discovery and linking, and to get the data out of the supplemental information and into the repositories where it will be well curated and findable and accessible. And data in supplements has been a real problem because it's often as PDFs, there's no metadata, and so forth. Similarly, the repositories have agreed to provide metadata and landing pages for the data and provide data citations, including DOIs or some other kind of PID, permanent identifiers, and then to support researchers. We're also helping the repositories, a large number of repositories, become Core Trust Shield certified. That means they're having dark archives and providing some of this other metadata support for them. Next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, thank you. So also we've worked as part of this project to build a repository finder, and this is based on the data that's in DataCite and RE3 data, and that's the website for it. And this is right now for the Earth and Space Sciences, but because it's built at DataCite and RE3 data, it's extensible to essentially all the sciences because all the major repositories worldwide are indexed there. And this finder will also help people find FAIR compliant repositories or ones that are at least Core Trust Shield certified. And for societies, publishers, just for your information, we're doing a full webinar on this project, or a full conference on this project that'll be planned for this spring. And if you're interested in attending or want further information, you can email me, or Shelley Stahl has been leading this at AGU. The next slide, please. And the last thing I'd like to do is just amplify a number of things that Tom said for kind of moving to a culture of open science, and that a variety of more work is needed. We really need all the stakeholders to be engaged and have a commitment for fair data and integrity in science. And this includes having people, researchers behave even in their role as peer reviewers and panelists and grant reviewers. As Tom mentioned, the infrastructure to support FAIR needs to be fully funded internationally, and that's a major challenge, but getting that first stakeholders involved will lead to the second, hopefully, pressure to have the infrastructure. Many repositories are on very short-term funding or kind of hand-to-mouth support. As Tom mentioned also, the reward process must recognize and incentivize FAIR data explicitly. And so there's a lot of things that societies and even things like the National Academy could do, but put in to join the Academy that you have to have treated your data fairly, for example, would be a great incentive to help codify this into the reward system. Similarly through tenure and promotion. And we focused on data, but software and samples and materials need to be incorporated much better. Fortunately, we have some good guidance for this, and some standards are moving through, but they need as much attention as data does. So thank you.
Thank you again. So if you have any questions, feel free to use your chat box to submit your questions, but I have a question to start. Do you think that FAIR can be used in biomedical research, and what changes would have to be made, and perhaps for human research subjects?
Okay, so that was something. It's not just human research subjects. There's also even some data security in the Earth and Space Sciences, for example, for rare samples and rare sample locations. But that's included in our recommendations, and in fact, some of the Earth and Space Science data are moving into that. For example, we have a large geohealth initiative that's looking at climate change and human health and other aspects of environmental aspects and health, pollution and health. So there are good ways of implementing FAIR and some standard ways for implementing FAIR with human subject or other privacy concerns. Usually these are addressed within the IRB as part of the proposal, or for secured access based on a need and anonymized data. So I think there's some very standard ways of working those in that both implement FAIR to the extent possible, and where anonymity or other restrictions are needed, has some standard ways of implementing that makes them fair for all researchers.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. Any other questions? Please feel free to use your chat box. If not, we'll go into our next poll, in which asks, after discussing implementation, do you think it is more likely that you or your institution will implement this recommendation? So just click whether it's a yes, A, B, no, and C, not sure. So I'll give you a few seconds to select your choice. So we see that some people are participating, but we see that there's a 29% that have agreed that yes, they will be implementing this supportive culture implementation. There's a 0% that said no, and the 71% that say not sure. So we'll have to work more on the implementation and discussion of what this is. So I think next.
So we're going to go ahead and move on to the second recommendation that we're going to discuss today, and we're going to go give the power back to Tom to open this discussion.
Thanks very much, Amanda. The second recommendation, key recommendation we'll cover here is implement training and education for open science by design. And two elements of that are research institutions and professional societies should train students and other researchers to implement open science practices effectively. And the stakeholders should also support the development of educational programs that foster open science by design. So the implementation actions for the recommendation include universities should provide training in best practices. And this is an area, this recommendation as a whole is one where we're only beginning to implement them. And so we have the discussant is from an organization that's one of the leaders in implementing this. But I think that Europe is ahead of the United States in this area right now. Research funders should support the development of training programs on open practices. Library and information science schools, professional societies, and other organizations should develop curricula and other courses on open science and practicing open science.
There's a little delay, so bear with us.
Okay.
Keep clicking.
Keep clicking.
Okay.
Research funders and professional societies should create programs or contests that seek the innovative integration and reuse of open data. And an example of this I saw last week was the Wellcome Trust is implementing a new program that's rewarding and recognizing reuse of data. Private sector, including for-profit companies and others, should create innovative educational tools.
Okay, so we have our next poll on this recommendation, similar to the previous recommendation. We're wondering if your institution is planning or has already started to implement this recommendation. And as you start to fill out this poll, we want to remind you once again to go ahead and ask questions throughout, and we'll get to them at the end of the recommendation section. We'll give you a couple of seconds to, I see some people are participating. Give you a couple more seconds to finish that. Well, it's pretty evenly split right now.
And Amanda, they can just click right.
Yes, just go ahead and click on the screen in the box, the check boxes in the screen to add your participation. Okay, it looks like, oh, here we go, good, good. It's always fun to watch the polls. So it looks like 30% have no plans, 30% have plans to begin implementation, 10% have started implementing, and 30% are not sure what just happened. Okay, so looks like we're going to go ahead and I would like to introduce Ian Sullivan, who is Head of Training at the Center for Open Science, and he's going to give us some tips on how to implement training of open science.
Hi, everyone. I spend a lot of time traveling around to different research universities talking about open science, and I will say that those poll numbers sound about right to me. I think one thing that it's worth addressing right at the beginning, and we can see in some of these slides here, I'll wait for it, is what exactly constitutes open science training. There's a lot that can fall into that umbrella, and as you can see from this list here of key elements, many of them like data management, particular software skills, as was mentioned, the publication of all research outputs, so the data, the material, the code. Many of these are things that you likely are already doing, or that there is direct demand for from researchers and graduate students at your institutions. One of the big challenges in terms of developing an open science training program is getting everyone to recognize that the specific skills that they have been dealing with in terms of using computers in research are directly related to some of the more potentially abstract discussions they have heard around open science and the general benefits of open science, or specific open science related practices like pre-registration and incorporating all of this in from the beginning at the study design stage. That's really what I mean there at the bottom with earlier is easier. There is a huge impression among people who first hear about open science. There's a huge focus in discussions about open science on the end of a research cycle. So get the data out there. How do we make it available? How do we make it fair? Get preprints out there. Where do we put them? That sort of thing. Our key approach and what we advocate for everyone who is considering putting together a open science related training program is to get people to move the considerations and the planning as early as possible. If you can have, taking fair data as an example, if you have the intention to publish that data and make it fair from the beginning of a process, then it becomes significantly easier for you to collect and maintain the relevant metadata, to shepherd that through the process, avoiding any potential liability issues or ethical dilemmas around data that cannot be shared, etc. So I'd say the two big challenges focused on here are get people to move all of this earlier and get them to recognize that all of these things are open science practices. In terms of getting them to actually implement them, I always go with a selfish altruism approach. Open science as a term tends to be mentioned in large and abstract discussions about the benefits that we can all have collectively. I think collective benefits are excellent, and the ideals are easy to get people to agree with, but I consider those more discussion starters and not the thing that I expect to motivate researchers at 3 a.m. when they just are trying to get that thing out the door. So for every action that we recommend researchers take, we provide in our own training direct personal benefit to the researcher as the first and most important reason they should adopt this. And hopefully we can all move towards that collective benefit at the end of the day. I'll say on this last slide that the motivation, once people get started, they tend to keep going. And one of the big advantages of open science is that that progress becomes really visible. So you have the opportunity while putting together programs on your campus to highlight progress on a range of issues across the board. The example that's listed here I found to be incredibly powerful when presenting to researchers. And you have that ability on all of your campuses because every one of your researchers that is practicing some of these open and reproducible practices is doing so in public, which means that you can talk to them, you can highlight their work, whether that's public commentary like this, example materials. You can talk to them about how these changes have improved and impacted the rest of their research organization or research outcomes. And having those local concrete examples is incredibly powerful at convincing other researchers to adopt these practices, as well as helpful in that intrinsic reward that we've been talking about to get those incentives lined up. It may not be formally included in the tenure and promotion review, but people who have a lot of attention on campus tend to get a lot of attention in those contexts as well. So you can help lead the charge in that regard. I'm available for any questions. I'll say that there's a lot of potential around training, and that if you look around your campus, you are quite likely to find informal training and support opportunities that have been set up by either individual motivated faculty or that are based in the library, or just peer support groups that are focused on some of these key elements related to open science training. There is a large and generally unmet demand for some of these particular skill-focused training elements. You have a great opportunity when trying to put together a more formal training program or support package to link all of those together and tie them into some of the ideals of open science movement for all of the participants at your researcher, and to highlight that for people outside of campus.
Thank you, Ian. We have a couple of questions for you and or Tom. If he also wants to jump in, feel free. So there's always a struggle between adding more training and adding more time to graduation. How should institutes fit open science training into the curriculum to prevent this?
So some of this goes back to the selfish altruism. Students are, I think, less interested in open science training than they are in training that enables them to do their science better and faster and more reliably, and that has more opportunities to document that work for future career progression. Those are two separate ways of describing the exact same training programs, and certainly one is much more likely to attract a lot more eager participants, which is why we always try and lead with that personal benefit. But you can certainly present all of these as efficiency gaining, career advancing, important work for doing your work that will make sure the results of that work stand the test of time better than they might otherwise.
Thank you. You mentioned that earlier is easier, and so we were wondering at what educational level should students be trained about what open science means? Should we start even earlier than grad school maybe, or what are your thoughts on that?
I am a big believer in the idea that open science is just science done right. I think that presenting, even when you talk with graduate students who have, like the one listed there in Twitter, engaged with this process, you find that it stops becoming an issue of separate and additional work. It's just how you get your work done. And every campus that I go to, I get the same answer from people when I say, who thinks we will be sharing less data in 10 years? Mm-hmm. You know, all of these things are moving norms, which means that moving the discussions about how this practice works and the introductions to things like reusing data sets and expecting that code will be available and so forth earlier and earlier into the science and general education curriculums, I think just is what will happen and the earlier we can get it, the earlier we can benefit from new generations of researchers who come pre-equipped with those understandings and maybe even some of the skills relevant to interacting with the wealth of data and materials that will result.
Thank you. Very interesting. I see we have some questions coming through. Don't worry, we will get to them in just a moment. But before we do that, we have another poll for you. After discussing implementation of training and education for open science by design, we were wondering, do you think you or your institution is more likely to implement? Yes, no, or not sure? You can go ahead and click in those boxes to participate in the poll. Getting a couple numbers in. Give you a few more seconds. Oh, here we go. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. Feel free to keep clicking if you haven't yet, but it looks like we're at about 38% saying yes, they are more likely than before, so that's very exciting. We're thrilled to see that. 13% said no, or 11% said no, we appreciate your honesty. We certainly want to know the truth. Down 40% and 10%, and then 50% are still not sure. I hope you can take some of this information back with you to your institution and change that not sure to a yes at some point. So we're going to go ahead and move on to just general questions for any of our speakers. We're going to go ahead and start with Stephen Heining's question. He's asking about this Plan S that's coming out of Europe, and I know that Tom knows a little bit about that, so I'm sure he can tell us more about it.
Right. So Plan S is the European Commission leading it, but a number of funders have signed on to it to make all articles available without charge within I guess within a year of or maybe it's 6 months is the period. And I think that this report and the other reports being addressed in the series all take on kind of big enterprise-wide sorts of issues, and making progress is going to involve broad stakeholder participation in moving forward. And this is no exception. And I think that with Plan S is an example of sort of a top-down mandate that where a lot of the funders have been imposing mandates and have for example, Gates and Wellcome Trust have established venues of kind of last resort that will publish the research that they support. So it doesn't need to appear in a journal. That they have their publishing platforms of the funder. And I think that this Plan S is kind of a next step, and I think that the discussion, there's been opposition, there's been a lot of discussion about how to implement it and what it means and what are the specifics. And I think that this is the sort of process, this sort of top-down mandate will kind of lead to reaction and grassroots reactions and adjustments to it. And that's how we'll move forward. And even though Plan S may have some unintended negative impacts on the enterprise, I think that it's these sorts of actions and reactions are how we'll move forward ultimately, I think.
And there's another question for all speakers. How can universities reward efforts towards open science and fair data practices? Any thoughts?
Hi, Tom. I'll jump in on that. I think that there are universities that are experimenting with new approaches to promotion and tenure, and I think in recent years, with the explosion in publications, with the kind of increase in the number of researchers and the number of researchers around the world, it has contributed to this emphasis on the journal impact factor and other fairly crude metrics to evaluate researchers and research. And so approaches such as limiting the number of publications that would be evaluated in a tenure process and promotion process by looking at other sorts of products and contributions. These things, having the institution, the department, re-examine what they're doing and what they're evaluating can play a big role. But I think that, again, this is a process where there are leaders that are looking at this, and that as they kind of develop new approaches to evaluation and assessment and publicize those and see how they work and refine them, that you will have broader adoption.
I'd like to invite any of our other speakers if they have any thoughts on this or on Plan S. Ben.
I've got a suggestion for the incentives and rewards. Mm-hmm. There's a huge opportunity here to experiment and innovate. The core hire people and give them tenure if they do these practices is obviously the heaviest lift, but there are dozens of other ways that people can experiment with much more easily and more cheaply. You could do things to draw attention to particular actions by researchers. As I was discussing earlier, you could do things like partner with the librarians and perhaps give out awards for researchers who are doing this so that they can attend additional conferences and present and look at some of those other things that researchers need to do to continue advancing their career and that are already calculated inside the tenure and promotion. So if you can provide small amounts of additional individual funding, that might provide a lot of incentive for people to participate and compete with that as an additional action on top of their other research work.
So this is Brooks. I'll say one thing on each thing. I think all the other answers on tenure promotion are good. It's a collective issue, so it's universities working together with societies and kind of the whole scholarly infrastructure. And I think when fair data gets recognized across the scholarly infrastructure, including Academy fellowships and society awards and recognition, that will help the conversation in universities and vice versa. On Plan S, there's a lot of complicated things on there. It's a certain number of funders now, and so I think it's not so much Plan S itself, but if it's implemented, what it cascades to, that people have the bigger thoughts on. And certainly there's some funders right now, like Gates was already mentioned, that are already requiring open access, and it's a specific Plan S that's disallowed open access in hybrid journals that I think is causing the most angst. The one thing I'll say is a lot of the things that we talked about on fair data, from a publisher's point of view and what we've done in our initiative, it takes time and effort, and that equals money. And similarly, in the Plan S model, where I think there's concern among the scholarly community is not so much about Plan S per se, though there's some about that, but it's about the incentives, and particularly the financial incentives, to what that kind of model means for quality and integrity. And so I think wherein that the way you be financially viable in something like in a world like that is to accept papers, and to accept papers as cheaply as you can. And so I think we do have to consider some of the unintended consequences, or how do we support quality in science, and quality isn't free.
Thank you. You were already talking about journals accepting papers, and I know that this is a struggle for journals, this open access, and how they're going to continue their business in this environment. So I was wondering if any of you have any more advice about how that can continue.
So just to clarify, at AGU we have 5 open access journals. So publishers have a mixed. Many publishers have. Some society publishers are entirely open access. So it's complicated there on how what this means for the business model, and I think it'll depend on how it plays out beyond the funders that are specifically endorsing Plan S.
Right, and I think another element is thinking about the future and thinking about the publication decision coming first, and where everything is kind of put out there, and then things are evaluated, and the more, you may have more prestigious venues that pick up and publicize research. So as technology enables this, and as the mandates go forward, you'll see, I think, different approaches to publishing and to revenue generation and sustaining the scholarly communications efforts.
Feel free to ask any questions using the chat box if you have any other. But this is for all three speakers. What concerns have you been hearing from institutions as you have disseminated the report results?
I think that one, and this is reflected, there's a AAU, APLU effort going on that's, I think, will involve a series of workshops around the country to look at open access, and I think open data in particular. And I think that and they had a very good report on this that came out toward the end of 2017, and what they want to avoid is kind of unfunded mandates. They want to have it clarified when a funder has a requirement for data management plan, say, that you have to provide a data management plan in the proposal, and if they're going to be enforcing that on the other end, where in order to apply for a new grant, you have to have fulfilled some requirements from your previous work, that they want to make sure that they aren't on the hook for providing access to something forever when the funds are not available for that. And they also, I think, want the funders to get together and harmonize some of the requirements so they don't have to twist themselves into knots in providing different things for different funders.
Great. Any other thoughts?
No, we're hearing the same
this
thing.
is exactly the same. I just wanted to echo and say that the prevailing objection, as was brought up in one of the other questions, is always some version of what another thing. Aren't there enough things that we're already required to do in enough different ways? Which is why we really try and focus all of our training efforts on ways to help you do the things you're already trying to do, including produce reliable research that you can build a career on faster and better and more accurately.
So this is Brooks. The one thing I'll add is I do think it's not always just one of the things, that there's ways of simplifying. So that's why in our project we thought it was a big win to get all of the publishers agreeing on one common set of author guidelines. And so that takes some of the confusion away from the researchers, because they're not doing, reformatting a paper if it gets rejected to submit to a different publisher and so forth, and lays a very common playing field for from a researcher's point of view and an institution's point of view. So I think if some of the funding agencies, so certainly I think there's one thing that can help is if there's some harmonization around data management plans, so that institutions kind of know what to expect, and there should be, because as the standards get implemented, there should be a leading practices for doing that and some harmonization across funders.
Great, thank you. We have another question. The question is around investigators move around, and who has responsibility for maintaining archives long term? Is it institutions, funders, publishers? How would you manage that?
Right. So that's kind of the $64 billion question. Today I think that those responsibilities in some cases may be unclear, and they vary by discipline. Some disciplines have very strong disciplinary archives or repositories where that are supported by kind of long-term funding from key agencies or foundations. The institutions have been setting up repositories for articles and for data produced at their institution. And so I think that this is a kind of a shared responsibility that will evolve over time, and where the standards and the clarity around the long-term effort and deciding what needs to be made available for the long term. Those are the sorts of things that disciplinary societies can play a lead role in kind of setting these standards and then bringing the researchers on board and gaining the support of the funding agencies to fund that long term.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. All right. I think, unless there's any other comments from our speakers, that we're going to go ahead and finish up. And go ahead.
So we would like to thank all the three speakers, Mr. Tom Arison, Dr. Brooks Hansen, and Mr. Ian Sullivan, for their time and participation. We really thank you for talking more about what open science means. And again, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So with that, we will conclude today's program. If you'd like to register for the next webinar in this series on February 19th, entitled Next Generation of Biomedical and Behavioral Science Researchers Breaking Through, please click on the link in the links box on the left-hand side of your screen. We'd also appreciate your feedback on today's webinar using the link to the webinar evaluation, also in the links box. You may access the recorded archive from this program by using the same login information that you used for today's live webinar. On behalf of the Association of American Medical Colleges and our FASA collaborator, we would like to thank our speakers and all of today's participants. Have a great afternoon, and you may now disconnect.
Thank you.